The war without end is 650 days old. There are clashes between Israel and Syria. And we'll have a conversation with one of Israel's most reflective and influential voices. It's Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And I'm Yonit in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. Brief housekeeping note. You know, we love doing this podcast, and you, our dear listeners, are helping us by following and subscribing. But I'm doing my Jewish mother tone here. More than 80% of you are still not subscribed to our YouTube. So please find us on YouTube, Unholy Podcast, and subscribe. That would be a huge help. And comment and share and, send it to your loved ones. And if you're on Spotify or Apple, please click the follow button and follow us. That's it. I'm done with my housekeeping notes. What else do you want to talk about, Jonathan?
If people were watching on YouTube, they would have seen that when you went into Jewish mother mode, you did literally wag your finger.
Didn't I?
You literally did. So it was as if you were scolding the young infant or members of our audience and telling them, now be good and subscribe. So these are the added bonuses you get if you see us on YouTube. You would have seen the wagging finger. In terms of talking of fantastic visual spectacles, I did see, and I wanted to mention to you and to our listeners, I worry I may have talked about this quite often, but I saw the new production of Fiddler on the Roof. Now,
I'm so jealous.
Could quite happily do a podcast every week simply talking about Fiddler on the Roof. I don't think we would run out of material. It is,
and it could still be called Two Jews on the News, right? It doesn't make a difference.
Good, you're right. So it really, really works. I mean, it is such a sort of central, totemic Jewish text. So many people, their understanding of their Jewish identity, of Jewish history, of their migrant great-grandparents or great-great-grandparents comes from the show Fiddler on the Roof, perhaps for many people the movie Fiddler on the Roof. It is central. And I have my own particular emotional attachment to it, which I think I may have mentioned before, which is that the opening notes of the show, my children laugh at this, I already need to reach for a tissue to wipe the tears from my eyes before the show has even begun, partly because the theme tune of my late father's radio program, You Don't Have to Be Jewish, was those opening strains of Fiddler on the Roof. I begin basically in tears and I just sort of dissolve further from there. I'm glad to say when I saw this production, which has won many awards, it's currently in its final days, which is really unhelpful of me to be mentioning it now, at the Barbican in London. I'm sure it's going to come back. I think it will transfer abroad. But I did notice that quite a few men of my age were also suddenly finding they had something in their eye and needed to, dab their eyes with a tissue. At the same moment, obviously, the Sabbath prayer scene in which Golda lights the candles and they welcome in the Sabbath. Here they, by the way, did that with the full prayer, the whole lot. It just gets people, and I just think it goes to something absolutely wired in so deep. For Jews.
And obviously a story that kind of will always resonate with us, right? Not only the issue of family tradition and navigating through that, but also, of course, growing anti-Semitism. See, I brought us back down to reality after you, with your elated conversation about Fiddler on the Roof. I heard that there's a sort of movie reboot in the making, I think, with director Thomas Kail, who directed Hamilton. And that made me think of who would be the classic Tevye in a movie production. By the way, I'm stealing this from Hey Alma, which is a cool internet site that said Paul Rudd has to be the new Tevye.
Well, it's funny because I love Paul Rudd. I think he's great. I'm not sure I'm buying him as Tevye just because I think does he have the sort of heft, the kind of physical bulk, and does he have he's good. He'll be good for the funny bits, but I'm not sure about the sort of poignant notes. But I'm happy to be surprised. As for a movie, do we want there to be a film or do we want to just leave this perfect thing as it is? Where are you on this?
I'm not a great fan of reboots. I like it when it's good, then don't do it again. But,
yeah, I sort of agree, really. I don't think you need to mess with it. I think we probably ought to get to the news. There has inevitably been lots of it. I mean, the war marks incredibly 650 days. Partly with that in mind, The New York Times did a big, long piece which was widely shared, pulling together many strands and much reporting on the handling of the war. And its central thesis was the notion that the Prime Minister, we're going to get into this, I think, in our interview, we're lucky to be joined by the brilliant journalist Ilana Dayan on the podcast, but the extent to which Netanyahu was has been prolonging the war in order to stay in power. That was the sort of through line through this piece.
Yes, using a lot of reporting, I think, that came from Israeli media, including from Ilana herself, a lot of mention of what happened before, leading up to October 7th, and then what happened after. I found it really interesting that a few days after this came out, you suddenly had a video of Netanyahu himself explaining why October 7th wasn't his fault and doing it in English. And it's, the first view on it, and by the way, in the most extreme, I think, version that we have heard so far, blaming it all on his defense echelon. Of course, he is entirely blameless. By the way, he called them these guys. These guys told me Hamas was deterred. And you ask yourself, but why are you doing this in English? And it's clear that it was his answer to the New York Times piece. Perhaps also worried that this percolated into the Trump administration. They read it too, so he was explaining himself. We should say, just in relation to what Netanyahu himself saying, right? He was never warned. There are indeed in this piece itself at least 4 examples in which the defense echelon warns Netanyahu of an impending war because of due to the internal terror in the Israeli society on October 7th. But of course, much more can be said about this piece. Yeah.
And the piece reports, doesn't it, that each time, the word they use, he was unmoved. He sort of impassive, as they tell him. Don't know when, don't know where, but this is a strategic warning of war, they tell him. And he's just unfazed and unbothered. Just your point about the video that he released, just a side note, in the form of an interview with this disembodied voice off camera, we obviously know is an aide, saying, I'm going to ask the hard questions. It's essentially interviewing himself. He obviously wrote the questions and then just answered them, and there is no comeback, no follow-up. Just a new stage in this flight from allowing himself to be held accountable, withdrawing from interrogation by his own country's media. Instead, he's now got to the point where only a handpicked aide is allowed to talk to him, and it's a sort of faux interview. So just as a side point on that, the pieces, I think, lays out a whole lot of compelling evidence. There is some new reporting, newly discovered memos and papers themselves, but as you say, much of it, or some of it at least, known to those who follow the Israeli media. Altogether, though, seeing it laid out, it makes a very comprehensive case that, as you say, that he was warned. He tried to afterwards blame others, and he's done that again in a very, very kind of vivid way. And key moments where a ceasefire was possible. He actually the piece takes you into the moments where all the stars were lined up. Envoys from all over are there ready to do the deal. And because in a couple of cases, Itamar Ben-Gvir is not happy, Netanyahu creates a reason to derail the whole process.
By the way, when you listen to Netanyahu's defense of himself, one of the questions that pops into your head is, if you are entirely blameless, being the prime minister of the country, the biggest catastrophe to befall the Jewish people since the Holocaust happens, but yet you are blameless, what is the problem with setting up a state's commission of inquiry? But the other question, the other thing relating to that, there are many Israelis who say the commission of inquiry, when it will be set up, should also investigate not only how we got to October 7th, but what happened with the attempt to return the hostages since October 7th. In any case, as we sit here now on day 650 of the war, as you mentioned, it does look, and I'm sorry we kind of sound like a broken record every week, but there is a certain progress made, flexibility made by Hamas, flexibility by Israel, who now does seem to agree to leave the Morag corridor. It's the parts that cuts through the Gaza Strip on the southern side of it. And you have the President of the United States yet again saying that he is optimistic. Maybe, let's keep our fingers crossed that this time we are indeed moving forward in the direction of bringing back the hostages after 650 days.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get on to the domestic Israeli political scene. In my mind, nothing happens until the Knesset session ends, because he will think it's easier for him to make a sort of bold move that could displease the far right out of Knesset session than in it, and therefore, what is it, 24th, 25th?
It's about a week from now. It's the 24th, essentially.
So therefore, my feeling has always been, you don't hold your breath till then, because he just won't do anything. Why would he? The fact that it's one more week in darkness and turmoil and in a dungeon for the hostages is no skin off his nose. He doesn't care about that. So he just will wait till it's politically convenient, if he does it at all, and who knows. I mean, just in terms of the war, as I say again, we're going to get into a full discussion of that with Ilana Dayan, but just to make the point that it does indeed go on, and each day there comes more word very specifically of these killings in, around, or near distribution points for food or water. There was one particular one that I think, which was in a different category at the weekend on Sunday, where due to what was described by the IDF as a technical error involving a drone, there was an Israeli airstrike on a line of people waiting to fill water containers last Sunday that was reported to have killed. And of course, we always make the point that numbers are disputed, but 10 people, including 6 children. Just a reminder of how every day there isn't an end to this war. It's ordinary people, in this case, people just queuing up to drink water, who pay the price. So each day of this has a very, very human cost.
In any case, we are still talking about a partial deal. That should also be on the table. We are talking about bringing back part of the hostages, a ceasefire, not an end to the war. That is what is on the table at this moment. I think it's interesting that the criticism against Israel is coming not only from the American left, but also we are hearing, I just saw a clip of Matt Gaetz, which I did not know, the man who almost became the Attorney General, is now on OAN, which is a far-right channel in the United States, and criticizing Israel for settler violence in the West Bank. He says it's Judea and Samaria, but that is the only kind of part of semantics that he doesn't agree with the American left. The rest, he kind of really has the scathing critique of Israel because of settler violence. That is, I think we, as Israelis, miss the fact that we are now hearing more and more criticism coming from the right in the United States, not only from the left. That is a big issue, I think, as well.
Yeah, and it's it's doubly sort of jarring, because it's not just from the right. There've always been critics of Israel, on the right, but it comes from the kind of evangelical far right. Mike Huckabee is the guy who, he's more pro-Israel than most Israelis in the sense of the far-right position. Yet he described this settler violence directed against a Palestinian American as terrorism. He used that word. You watch the Matt Gaetz video. It's there. You can find it on social media. I was struck by it the same way you were. I mean, if you read a transcript of it, it would be indistinguishable from an equivalent voice on the kind of far left. I mean, it sounds like somebody from, the world of The Intercept or The Nation magazine or something. The way he talks about Israeli investigations, you can't trust them, that this person was killed using weapons paid by American taxpayers. He hits all the buttons that would be on the left. And yet, as you mentioned right at the beginning, says it's Judea and Samaria, the media call it the West Bank. You're sort of doing a double take, because he's hitting the talking points of the pro-Israel far right, even as he then moves into a critique of the far left. This is something fairly new, I think. And it's really worth noticing that while there are all these splits going on in MAGA world at the moment about Trump appearing to U-turn on aid for Ukraine, getting tougher on Vladimir Putin, the obviously involvement in the attack on Iran, the refusing to release the Epstein files. This is another one of these strange fault lines that's opening up, where people within the pro-Israel MAGA wing are nevertheless scathing about this kind of settler violence. At the moment, they're only scathing when it when its victim is an American citizen. But still, just an example of how a lot of people, including Netanyahu, who sort of bet on permanent, unconditional support from the American right, they may not be that may not be as reliable as they have been assuming.
Mm-hmm. We should talk about Syria. Because in the volatility that is the Middle East, I think a week or two ago, we were talking about how, al-Jolani, the new Syrian president, can be perhaps someone who will join the Abraham Accords. And remember Trump saying that he's lifting the sanctions from Syria and calling him a handsome man. And indeed, Israeli top officials meeting with him more than once. And suddenly you see this attack of the Israeli Air Force against targets in Damascus and in the southern part of the country. All of this is because of a brutal massacre carried out by militias with the encouragement of the regime against the Druze community. We'll put a pause on this. The Druze community, which is a minority in Syria and Lebanon, and indeed in Israel. And in Israel, they have a very special connection. There's a very kind of a unique connection between the Druze community and the Jewish community. It's been, if we can call it that way, forged in fire. The Druze community indeed go into military service. They're slightly different from the Arab Israeli community. And what they were very concerned about was what was happening to their brothers in Syria. Indeed, a few hundred of them actually breached the fence between the two countries to try and help. They pressured the Israeli military to do something about it, and the Israeli military did, which is also a first in that regard, kind of Israel seeing itself as a military power, a regional power, doing this kind of act that the Americans, for this point, as we said here on Thursday, managed to stop. There's sort of a ceasefire in both sides. So the killing has stopped in Syria, and the attacks from the Israeli side have stopped as well. It's a very volatile moment. We really have a hard time still trying to figure out if this man, would the real Syrian president please step up? Is he Ahmed al-Shara? Is he Abu Muhammad al-Jolani? The fact that he has been surrounded by radical Islamists is, of course, something to note, and is, first and foremost, very problematic for Syria itself.
Yeah, and just again how this complicates the relationship with the United States. Trump just wants good news out of this Syria story. The new
Trump
guys
just wants to talk about anything that isn't the Epstein files first,
sure,
and then let's bring in good news from the Middle East.
That's also true, actually. Maybe in that case he doesn't mind this because it's a distraction. But his view is attractive guy, strong guy in Damascus. So, shake hands, solve the problem. I don't want to hear anything else. And the idea that Israel is still hitting Syria, that's not in the script. That's not in his Nobel Prize winning script, in which Syria comes in from the cold and everyone makes nice. So it's just yet another example of these divergences between the world as Donald Trump's Washington sees it and the world as even Trump's big allies, but Netanyahu and the right, see it in Israel. There are these differences of opinion, and Syria is a good example of that.
So we want to say something more about Israeli politics, although we couldn't avoid talking about it thus far into our episode. But something dramatic of sorts did indeed happen. We'll call it a lot of hot air and no explosion yet. But what happened this week, and is very relevant to whatever else happens in Israel, is the fact that two parties, ultra-Orthodox parties in Netanyahu's government, made their move. And we'll talk about the move in a minute. We'll just explain. Everything in the background has to do with the draft bill. The ultra-Orthodox want an exemption from military service, and they demand Netanyahu write a bill that does that officially. It's very complicated now when there's a war going on, and there are large parts of the Israeli society that are doing their part in military service and in reserve service as well. So what happened was that the Shas party quit the government because there is no bill. They stayed in the coalition. I'll get to that in a moment. United Torah Judaism quit both the coalition and the government. Now, of course, you would be saying to me, well, that certainly means that is the end of Netanyahu's government. No, it doesn't. And the reason for that is, if you could bear with me for a moment, it's complicated Israeli, a political maneuvering here. But the only way the essential only way to topple a government would be to vote on a bill that says dissolve the Knesset and then go to elections. You would need 61 votes to do that. And you will not have 61 votes to do that because the ultra-Orthodox, with all of their moves to quit the coalition or quit the government, do not want elections now and would not vote if that bill is put forward. By the way, anyone who knows a lot about Israeli politics would point out that there's also something called the constructive no confidence vote, and when you could essentially have 61 votes and change the prime minister and the government and not go to elections. That's never happened before. I doubt it will happen now. Now, why do we keep talking about that line of 24th of July? That is because when the Knesset is in recess, all of what I described is markedly more complicated to do. The opposition don't have 61 votes for this, so it doesn't matter, but it's more complicated if you're in recess. The Knesset returns October 19th. That means this whole mess returns to preoccupy us then, and I think it will be much more complicated for Netanyahu to maneuver.
And it just goes to my point about how this is the period in which he would have some more room for maneuver. I think people would be perhaps from other parliamentary systems amazed at quite how long this hiatus is that we're talking about from July all the way to October. It's because of this combination of the summer and
holidays,
the high holidays. That just means it's really 3 months of room for maneuver he has. And so I think if I was one of those White House officials, I would not be bothering to get a ceasefire this week. Instead, just think about that period. That's when there may be some movement. And is our assumption that given, as you say, things will be much harder for him once he comes back, that given his strength, we're going to get into it with our guest, but given his strength, given the fact that he did have this amazing military success with Iran and so on, that early elections and using this period to prepare the ground for a dissolution in the autumn, that's looking more likely, relatively speaking?
I think it is. I mean, in the sense that, first of all, the earliest that can happen is around January, because even if the Knesset comes back and then dissolves, it's still a 3-month period by Israeli law that you need the minimum to go to elections, not like you guys who could have, 5 weeks and then go to elections.
3.
So
we can do 3.
So that would be fun. But here it takes 3 months. So the earliest would be a January, February election, but I think we could definitely be looking at that. Netanyahu would decide to go to elections when he thinks it will be good for him. I think, again, no one in the political arena now would bet that the elections will be when they're originally slated, which is October of 2026, more than a year from now.
Yeah. We should mention Ayman Odeh, a figure who garnered a lot of attention, including internationally, when he had this breakthrough as the leader of a joint list of the Arab parties. I think 15 seats they won in the Knesset in that first go-round. It made him, I think, the leader of the second biggest opposition party at one point, and sort of seemed to presage a new future in which Israel's Arab minority took an equal part in the politics of the country. New generation, a very kind of open-minded new leader. But that seems to have come to a rather sorry end.
Yes, well, first of all, we should say that at this moment in time, the attempt to oust Ayman Odeh from the Knesset has failed. Essentially, this is a weird thing in the first place for the Knesset to oust one of its members when they are elected by the people. So that is a problem in itself, but you need a supermajority for that. You need 90 members of Knesset. The Likud tried to oust him, quoting a tweet of his after the release of Israeli hostages. He wrote something about rejoicing over the hostages that were released and the Palestinian prisoners that were released. He didn't say Palestinian terrorists. That was enough for the Likud to try and oust him. To be honest, this was more a sort of political move for show, because Ayman Odeh is planning, in any case, to leave the Knesset. It was pretty clear that this is very, very thin on legal grounds. But I think what's interesting about this story, besides the story of Ayman Odeh himself, which, as you mentioned, sort of arrived at the scene in 2015. I could just tell you, Jonathan, what we did then was a debate between all of the heads of the different political parties in Israel. At the time, Netanyahu and always disagrees to have a debate, so we wouldn't have a debate at that moment with Bougie Herzog, who was the head of the Labour Party. So instead, we had every leader of every other party in the studio together. And I remember Ayman Odeh stepping in. No one knew who he was. He was completely anonymous, and he was a star. I mean, he opened his mouth. He spoke to Aryeh Deri. He said to him, "Listen, we're the Arab Israelis. You're the Mizrahim. Let's cooperate together." You know, the man was a star when he started out. I think his story, what happened to him, to his party, remember, he, I think, is somewhat to blame for the fact that the Arab lists didn't run together in this election, also leading to the success of Netanyahu, and also what happened to the Israeli right and parts of the society who were less tolerant in listening to what he was trying to say. So this is a story in itself, but what I think that the issue here, the big story with the Ayman Odeh attempt was to the fear of the Arab community, not only the Arab community, that there is an attempt to stifle the Arab vote and the Arab representatives in the Knesset. And of course, this has deep meaning, because if there is less and less of an Arab vote, there is less power for the bloc that is an anti-Netanyahu bloc. So this is a bigger political story than only Ayman Odeh. And you will, I think, see more and more instances of this type of attempts, because it is very clear, and even the opposition in Israel that is occasionally slow to realize things, even they realize that the point here is beyond Ayman Odeh.
I think this goes to a failing by the opposition movements, parties in Israel going back many decades, which is to realize there is a chunk of Israeli society, some 20%, that could be their political allies and give them, actually, if it all came to them, a permanent hold on power in the Knesset, for 15, 16 more seats or so. That hasn't happened partly because there has not been, and this is the work of decades, I'm not talking about one politician or one election campaign, but an attempt to bring that constituency in, to be felt to be part of Israeli democratic politics and to be a sort of permanent ally. Instead, you have even opposition leaders saying, I will form a government, but without relying on the Arab parties or without using the Arab parties, as if there is a taboo around that. I understand where that comes from, but it's not, wise, and it means you end up shunning people who could be, well, as you said, sort of stars in Israeli politics. And that's why there's some sadness about the fate of Ayman Odeh. But long term, I think Israel will have to make a full-blooded place for people like him and for those parties in its democratic politics, in part of government and so on. The last government, of course, did have an Arab minister. Was he a minister? Maybe he wasn't a minister, but he was in the coalition, in the form of Mansour Abbas of the Islamist Party. So, it's possible, but I think not many people thinking it's likely for the next round, given all the fallout from October 7th. So we should get to our guest, and I'm glad to say it's a return visit from a great friend of the podcast who always manages to be reflective and very wise, and we're glad to have her back on.
Ilana Dayan is, I think it's safe to say, the most well-respected journalist in Israel. She's a juggernaut of Israeli television and spearheaded the investigative news program Uvda for the past 30 years, a dear friend of mine and of this podcast. Ilana, thank you so much for being back on Unholy.
It's always good to be here, especially to hear you make this introduction and reaffirm our friendship.
I'm very glad. I could go on, by the way, but I have so many questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
So let's start with that. I mean, look, last time we talked was September 2024. It's been 650 days into the war in Gaza, brief war with Iran. Let's talk a little bit about the pulse of the nation. Where are we? Are we beginning to get our bearings back, to breathe easier, or would that be actually impossible before the hostages come home?
I can tell you about myself. I still cannot breathe. I think we are all so tired. We are really exhausted of almost 2 years of war. We are dead worried to the hostages. We are mad angry at a disconnected leadership that is dragging this war, that is going nowhere, that for a long time has run its course, that has been dealing with the ultra-Orthodox, trying to eternalize the exempt for them, from serving in the military while soldiers were still falling in Gaza the very same day. And you and I were waiting for the affirmation of the IDF spokesman to publish their names, but the politicians knew that it happened and still were dealing and willing. But I think that the one thing that we can say is that after so much time of being stuck on October 7th, I think October 8th at least has dawned on us. We finally can ask and have to ask the tough questions with regard to our leadership, with regard to the tragedy in Gaza, with regard to this endless war. And I'm sure that history will judge them. History will judge leadership, but Yonit, it will judge us too. Have we been asking the right questions, the tough questions, at the right time? And I'm worried, and I think that we haven't been doing that for a long time now.
So I'm struck by what you say about now being October the 8th, because I'm tempted to say if now really were October the 8th, anger and disillusion in the Prime Minister would be at its highest pitch. But instead, I'm just looking at the polling and assessing Prime Minister Netanyahu's political strength at the moment. It seems as if it's very much 650 odd days on from the moment where people were at their angriest with him for having allowed October 7th to happen. So how do you assess that? The sense that, from a distance at least, I get that in some ways that a lot of time has passed when it comes to how Israelis feel about him, to the point where you think if there were an election tomorrow, or more likely, in the coming months or year or next year, he may well emerge again as the Prime Minister.
First of all, let's take the facts, Jonathan. As far as Netanyahu is concerned, it's way past October 7th. As far as Netanyahu is concerned, I guess this war starts either on September 27th, 2024, when he took down Nasrallah, when the IDF took out Nasrallah, or on June 13th, when the strike against Iran was launched. For Netanyahu, history began once again. For him as the leader of Israel, for him as the politician, and for him as the one and only political figure that I can think of that has taught us a lesson about the making of a legacy. The making of a legacy both over the skies of Tehran, and he has got a fair share of the credit for the bright success of Israel in the 12 Days War against Iran, but also the making of a political legacy. The guy who was at his lowest on October 7th, who brought upon Israel the worst catastrophe ever, stayed on the wheel, as Arik Sharon used to say, and then took off from there. When you think about it, if Netanyahu had a master plan to stay in power, it started on Saturday, October 7th at 6:40. We exposed the first telephone conversation that Netanyahu had with his top military advisor, General Avi Gil, at 6:29. And he asks Avi Gil, why do they shoot? And then at 6:40, he says, I see nothing in the intelligence. 3 weeks later, he tweets that neither the Shin Bet nor the military intelligence warned him ever about a possible attack on the part of Hamas. He deleted this tweet a couple of hours later. Last week, he released a video which goes much further, putting all the blame on the military, the intelligence, the Shin Bet. This time, he didn't delete anything. Netanyahu, on his way, on those days of September 2024, on his way to a critical discussion with the IDF brass about the strike against Nasrallah, had a secret meeting with Gideon Sa'ar in a hiding place around Tel Aviv. And he closed the deal with Gideon Sa'ar minutes before he gave the okay to take out Nasrallah. And Gideon Sa'ar was part of the coalition, perhaps the biggest enemy of Netanyahu within Likud, came back to the coalition 2 days after Nasrallah's assassination. So I think that Netanyahu's political ability, his ability to outmaneuver everyone else, to let his rivals see his dust, to spin the news, to sway the President of the United States, and also to bring true, hard, concrete achievements on the way. All of that together can explain the fact that he's once again touching the 30 mandates on the polls, that he's as strong as he has ever been since October 7th. But it doesn't mean, Jonathan, that Israelis want Netanyahu to stay in power. Because at the end of the day, the three main issues on the Israeli agenda nowadays are issues on which the vast majority of Israelis oppose the policy of this government. Over 82% want a hostage deal and the war to end. Over 2/3 of the population in the polls want a state commission of investigation on the October 7th event. And over 2/3 of Israelis, the vast majority of Israelis, think that the ultra-Orthodox should be serving in the military. And they see what the government is doing or not doing in that respect. So I don't know if Netanyahu will win the next elections. I know that on the one hand, he's fragile. On the other hand, he's as strong as he has ever been since October 7th. And he is still one of a kind, a league of his own, as a political figure. That should not blind us from seeing his dark side, his cynical side, and his dangerous side.
Definitely, probably the most complicated and complex politician of our time. And I think you've laid that out incredibly well, the sort of the successes and the dark sides. And I wonder, where does that lead us when it comes to Gaza? First of all, are we looking finally at the end of the war, or he can actually prolong it as long as he wants to? When it does end, will we look and ask ourselves, could it have ended 2 months ago, or maybe more than that? And the other question about Gaza, I think, and you talked very powerfully about, were we asking the right questions? That history will judge us as the media as well. But I mean, in the sense of the human tragedy in Gaza and how that will affect not only the Palestinians, obviously, but also us for years to come.
I've been to Gaza last Friday. I've been to Jabalia. I've been with officers and fighters of 401 Brigade. And I had a conversation with one of the officers who've been, breathing Gaza, fighting in Gaza, living Gaza, and seeing death in Gaza ever since October 7th, almost. And I asked him, when will you know that we've won this war? When will you know that a significant damage to the capability of Hamas is significant enough? And, at first he told me that he knows what he's doing, and they are bombing tunnels, and they are taking out Hamas terrorists, and they are doing that and that and that, and he showed me everything on the screen and on the field. And then he said, I'm thinking about it as well. And we talk about it among ourselves. Will we ever know that we won? And he admitted, we will not be able to kill the last Hamasnik. We will not be able to take the last Kalashnikov. We will not be able to bomb the last tunnel. There is no complete and total victory, unlike the slogan that Netanyahu is still trying to coin. And there is a tragedy in Gaza. And there is a sense within the IDF forces that this war has run its course. Last time we talked, I remember I told you that wars end. At the end,
that was your most optimistic take.
And you thought that we can be more optimistic than that. I think today, as we talk Thursday morning, we can be a little bit more optimistic because of the reports from Doha, because all of a sudden the Morag corridor is history, as well as the Philadelphia corridor became history, and the Netzarim corridor became history. When Netanyahu feels perhaps that he should be more flexible vis-a-vis Trump than he should be vis-a-vis Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. So I think that Israel now, also given, I think, the weight of the chief of staff, Eyal Zamir, after the achievements in Iran, and given that he is the chief of staff selected by Netanyahu, and everybody knows that Zamir thinks that this war is all but over, that we have to bring the hostages back, that it will not happen with any kind of fantastic military operation. And you know what? I know that Zamir himself, before becoming chief of staff, when he was the general manager of the Ministry of Defense, 3 weeks into the war, in closed conversations, he talked about the day after. Back then, 3 weeks into the war, Eyal Zamir was terribly frustrated of the fact that the government is not talking about the day after. The reason for which Netanyahu has not been doing that is because of his political survival considerations, because he knew for a long time that the end of the war is the end of his coalition. Is it still the fact? I don't know. But I know that Netanyahu is in a different position. This morning, it's obvious. Hamas needs this war to end. We still have to ask ourselves, by the way, all of us who want the war to end and the hostages to come back, we have to ask ourselves, what will be the day after like? Will Hamas will still be on its feet? Will they be able to reconstruct and renovate and recuperate? That's something that we should be very worried about. But let's say that this time, I hope that Trump is optimistic for a reason.
I want to follow up the second of Yonit's two questions when she said about the human tragedy in Gaza and what impact that has now and will have for the years to come on Israelis. Because I notice that when those Israelis who want the war to end make their case, they make it, I have to say, entirely understandably, in terms of bringing the hostages home and ending the deaths of Israeli soldiers in action and saying that now the war has no purpose and it's needless. That's how the argument is framed. And I just want to hear from you what Israelis, how they sort of reconcile themselves to what I have to say is how people are seeing this war outside, which is that every day it seems there's 10 or 20 or 30 plus or minus, somewhere around that kind of number, of Palestinians killed as they line up for food or water in these distribution sites. I don't think anyone says they're Hamas operatives or so on. They're just people who need to eat and drink. How much that is part of the argument for why this war has to end? I say it partly because, one of the time I came of age was the first Lebanon War, 1982. And I remember that the argument that was made that brought 400,000 Israelis onto the streets of Tel Aviv after Sabra and Shatila was not this is affecting the mortal threat to us. It was more that this is an affront to Israeli and Jewish values, that this massacre, which Israelis didn't commit, Christian phalangists committed, but just that these Palestinians are dead is an affront to us. It seems as if people don't want to particularly make the argument in those terms. They make it instead in terms of hostages, Israeli soldiers. I just would like to hear what you think is again, in the way that Yonit framed it, what the impact that is on Israelis for the years to come, that we're looking at this sort of death toll day after day, and it can't really be framed the way it used to be framed as, we were pursuing a Hamas operative. It's just civilians being killed trying to get food and drink.
You're asking about what Israelis are thinking and saying and doing, and I'll tell you about this particularly Israeli that you're talking to. This particularly Israeli happens to think that this war started after Hamas launched this brutal attack against our communities, that this was as just and moral war as you can think of. This particularly Israeli that you're talking to knows that it's more complicated than that. I see the figures, I see the images. I'm as horrified as you are, Jonathan. But I know for a fact, because I've been there and I've talked to them and I try to understand, I know for a fact that it is truly more complicated than that. About a month ago, Sarit Magen, my colleague, and I conducted dozens of conversations with fighter pilots and officers in the Israeli Air Force. I was working on a piece that had to do with the fact that there is a turmoil within the Air Force concerning what they call collateral damage and the tragedy of civilian population in Gaza. And one of them did tell me, he's a veteran fighter pilot, he's on the reserve now, and he told me about instances in which they tell him that there is a terrorist to be taken out, and then he sees bodies of young children taken out of the tent, and he asks the people who gave him the coordinates, how come? On the other hand, I talked to another fighter pilot who is a liaison working with an infantry brigade, and he told me, Ilana, it's not the way you think it is. We are doing our best to avoid collateral damage as best we can. I can tell you that these guys, the infantry guys themselves, are well aware of it. And when I talk to them and when I tell them we will not strike from the air, even though you want us to, because there are too many uninvolved citizens over there, they accept it. So I can tell you from these conversations, it is not one-dimensional. It is more complicated. On the other hand, I think that we had perhaps the privilege to look the other way for a while, when we were consumed in our own tragedy, our own loss, our own pain. We don't have that privilege anymore. And I think what you're saying goes even further than that. I think we ought to be concerned about the tragedy in Gaza and the images and the hundreds of thousands who are displaced and the tens of thousands who were already killed, not only because of our image in the world, but because of our image vis-a-vis ourselves. Because we have to look those images in the eye and we have to look on ourselves in the mirror. And the longer this war prolongs, the tragedy will be not only bigger, but will be almost impossible to come out of and to get some normal life back in Gaza. How many years will it take? And how will we live with what has been happening there? But Jonathan, again, it's difficult and it's complicated and it's complex and it's not just, it truly is not black and white. It is black and white when you look at the specific instance and when you understand that it could have gone another way, it could have been done differently. There are instances like that. But I think eventually, at the end of the day, I think the IDF is given an impossible mission. It is an impossible mission to be both moral and effective, to be both subordinate to the political leadership and loyal to the values of Israel as you and I know it, of the IDF as you and I know it, of the military that my kids, all of them, served in. Our neighbor next door is still there in Rafah. I guess it's a question with not a very good answer. And that's part of the fact that nobody really tried to complement military might with some diplomatic solution. Nobody wanted to talk about what will happen there, who will take over. Because, Jonathan, if Hamas is still there when the war is over, we have done nothing. But for Hamas not to be there, we have to bring someone else. To bring someone else, we have to pronounce the syllables of the Palestinian Authority or some kind of Arab joint force. And that is something which political leadership was not willing to discuss.
To be honest, I'm not sure there is a deep conversation about the people who are ideologically against the deal, who think that the price of this kind of deal will be worse than what is happening now. And a deep conversation, a serious conversation about ending the war now and what does that mean if Hamas is not yet eradicated. It seems like everything has been sucked into that vortex of either you're for Netanyahu or you're against him. If you're against him, everything he does is from the wrong reasons. If you're for him, then, he is the answer to all your questions. But the truth is that we are, and perhaps again, we are guilty of that from our position too, but we are not having the deep discussions at all, it seems.
But Yonit, if he is doing what he's doing from the wrong reasons, that is the true conversation, or at least a vast part of it. If we have a prime minister who is doing what he's doing from the wrong reasons, that is part of the true conversation, the deep one. This is one thing. The other thing, that when it comes to his political considerations, part of the piece of the New York Times, one of the interesting revelations that was hidden between the lines is that when American officials pointed out that back then, at the spring of 2024, some 50% of Israelis in the polls said that they are in favor of a deal, he said, not 50% of my voters. Mm. So the fact that he's catering to his own base, that he keeps working on his own base, by the way, the fact that his coalition will survive the living of Shas and Agudat Israel and Yadut HaTorah is because The base is still there. The parliamentary bloc might be dismantling, but the base is still there. And the base is not going to desert Netanyahu. This is the second thing. But the deepest thing about the hostages, Yonit, is that, yes, I agree with you. We can go deeper in the conversation when it has to do with the prices. I remember Rachel Goldberg-Polling telling you the answer to what you said. Yes, there is a price to the deal, but there's a higher price to not doing the deal. And I think that the deepest conversation is going on. The deepest conversation has to do with the fact that the hostages will define us. I'm sure of that, Yonit. I'm willing to discuss the price and the names of the terrorists that will be released and what will happen in Gaza afterwards. And will it motivate Hamas more to kidnap more hostages, more Israelis after we do a deal, which, I think they're motivated anyway. It has nothing to do with the deal. But if there's one thing that I feel from the bottom of my heart is that the hostages made us meet who we are and who we want to be. The hostages forced us to look ourselves inside and to decide, do we want to be the Jewish nation that keeps solidarity and caring for the other as the pillar of our identity? Do we stand behind what we always say, that this is not Manhattan, they will not let you fall in the street, that nobody will come to help you. This is not the cold and alienated, sorry, Jonathan, UK or the British way of life, that when your kid is out to the university is not under your responsibility anymore. No, my kid is always my kid, and my neighbor's kid is also my kid. And the son of Anat Engest is also my kid. And the son of Idit Ohel is also my kid. And the son of Einav Zingauker is also my kid. I think that's what the hostages made us understand. And I spoke this morning with Vicky Cohen, the mother of Nimrod, and I spoke yesterday to the father of another hostage. And I spoke the day before yesterday with the father of a hostage who didn't make it back. He was murdered in captivity. And every time I talk to them, I understand something about what this really is deeply on it. Deeply, the hostages story is much more than the number of the Palestinian terrorists that will be released to get them back. It's something that has to do with the core of our identity. This is the real discussion. This is the real conversation. This is why we have to listen to Rachel Goldberg-Polling. This is what I felt when I interviewed Eli Sharabi, when he came back from captivity after 500 days in shackles, starved, and looked like a Muslim. I felt that I need for people to listen to him, to understand, to see him, and to feel what it is like. And that's what I'm trying to tell you, Jonathan. Yes, we are still, in a way, immersed in our own pain, and I think rightly so.
The question that Rachel Goldberg-Polling put to us and to all Jews and Israelis in a way, surely the evidence is now in. The question has been answered. I mean, what does this say about us, was her question. And you're saying that the self-image has always been that Israelis will look after each other, as each other's brother and sister. That hasn't happened. The country did not stretch every possible sinew to bring them back. That's in a way, what's behind my point about Netanyahu's delay.
But
surely you can't keep saying that Israelis are
saying.
different from Britons and Manhattan and everything because we would bring people back, because they didn't. And they had a choice. The leader chose not to. So surely we now know the answer to that question, and it's not a happy one.
But we also know that when it happens, it will happen because the people went out to the street. We also know that the vast majority of Israelis are still applying pressure. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps they could have been angrier. Perhaps they could have done more. But
my beef is not with Israelis. It's with
the leadership.
Yes.
In that sense, yeah, we are all saying the same. But yes, you are asking, and rightly so, are Israelis doing enough? Are they putting enough pressure on government? Are they angry enough? Are they furious enough? I have to tell you that I had an amazing encounter back in, I believe it was in February of this year. The second deal was already underway. And the brother of Itai Dekel-Chen, who was still in captivity back then, invited me to a meeting in his moshav with a Garin Torani. He is Chozer B'Tshuva, he's religious, even though he was born in Kibbutz Nir Oz, much like his brother. And most the guys there were against the deal. Most their female partners were in favor of a deal. And you could see how ideology blends with caring. How the fact that these people are right-wingers, hardliners, but when it comes to the hostages, they're different. You can see it in Efrat, in Gush Etzion, in Bet El, in Shiloh. You can see it in settlers and relatively light Orthodox who are coming to the demonstrations, who are coming to the hostages square. I think that Israelis do care. They manifest it in every poll. I have no good answer to the question of why didn't they succeed in exerting enough pressure on the government to change its course with regard to a deal.
Yeah, well, I guess when you're busy, doing 400 days of reserve service and trying to survive financially because your business is closed, because of that, it's difficult to expect, 100,000s or millions of Israelis to take to the streets. But you're right about the polls. They're consistent and they're getting actually bigger numbers on that column of who wants to end the war and to bring back the hostages. As we're speaking, the government is really not halting, not on the issue of the draft bill and not on the issue that has been Israel's focus, the government's focus before October 7th, and that is the judicial overhaul or the judicial coup. And this is continuing, in fact, trying to oust the attorney general, which is, of course, complicated, but that's not stopping this government. And, of course, there's a pretty clear conflict of interest when that is what you're trying to do while the prime minister is standing on trial. But can you talk a little about what you see as the most worrying part of what the government is trying to do? In this
Oddly enough,
process?
Yonit, I think the most worrisome act has already taken place. I think the ousting of Ronen Bar as head of the Shin Bet is the peak of the judicial overhaul. I know that there is a host of statutes and laws that they are trying to promote, trying still to change the commission that selects judges, trying to hurt the free press, trying to dismantle the public broadcasting, trying to finance organizations according to political identification, trying to pass a law that will enable them to oust seniors of the public service, from the head of Mossad to the chief commissioner of the police, within 100 days of a new government being elected. And I'm reminded of something that Uzi Arad, who used to be a prominent advisor and the national security advisor of Bibi Netanyahu in the 90s, he told me once that back in the early 90s, Netanyahu told him to stay in power in Israel, you need 3 people that will be your own: the head of the investigations in the police, the income tax commissioner, and the head of the Shin Bet. And that's why I think that the fact that Netanyahu launched this showdown, this immense drama, eventually being successful in ousting Ronen Bar as head of Shin Bet, and I'm leaving aside the fact that Ronen Bar had responsibility for the fiasco of October 7th. He assumed responsibility. He said that he's going home. But then Netanyahu convened on, I think it was March 20th, a government meeting in which they lashed out against Ronen Bar, including, some kind of insinuations to conspiracy theories. Why didn't he wake up the prime minister? And the fact that he undermined Israeli interests and all sorts of allegations, to which Ronen Bar responded with an amazing letter. I remember I was in the studio that night. I was broadcasting, of course, another program of Uvda, and then I got the letter of Ronen Bar that was published that very evening, in which he says that the prime minister tried to make him sign a document that will enable the prime minister not to present himself to cross-examination, to his testimony in court, that he had the prime minister asking him to act against activists of the political process, that he was told by the prime minister that if it comes to a constitutional crisis, he has to obey the government and not the Supreme Court. So that's amazing. And Yonit, when I try to think about who is this Bibi Netanyahu, who launched a personal attack, a dangerous one, against the most sensitive organization in the fabric of Israeli democracy, because the Shin Bet is not only an anti-terrorist organization, it's also in charge of keeping Israeli democracy, of coping with undermining forces, all those delicate areas of a security organization. Who is this Bibi Netanyahu? And I think that if you take the span of a decade between 2015 and 2025, you can understand it. The Bibi Netanyahu who won the elections in 2015 against all odds, against the opposition that was aligned against him, against the elites, against the media, against the academia, against all those radical leftists who were against him, against the United States, he decided that he will take revenge. And then, on 2016, he got the reason, because the investigation started. On 2017, the investigations became public. On 2018, they were completed. On 2019, the indictment was served. On 2020, the trial began. And ever since, this corruption trial is managing our lives. This is the single most important event of our lives, because this is the event driving Netanyahu to make sure that he stays in power. And that's the event that fueled both his political stamina and his readiness to cope, once with Yariv Levin, then with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, and then with everybody else, against Ronen Bar, and now against Gali Baharav Miara, the Attorney General. So I think that's really the culmination of a process that began a decade ago. And yes, it comes back to Bibi Netanyahu, to his persona, to the different sides of his persona, and the fact that this event that is driving him against Ronen Bar is eventually erupting not only on Ronen Bar himself, but I guess on all of us, in a way.
Just a small question here. You rightfully point out that the Shin Bet is upholding Israeli democracy, has an important part in that, and making sure the elections, for instance, are fair and free. Will the next election in this country be fair and free?
I hesitate to answer you like Arik Sharon used to answer us. That's not the question.
Actually, that was Bibi's line. That was always Bibi's line when he still spoke to mainstream media. Right?
Yeah, I think he got it from Arik. I think there will be elections. They will presumably be free, but I think they can be disturbed and contaminated in different sort of small and soft ways. Will there be cameras in Arab villages and ballots? Will there be a political attempt to stop some parties from being part of the political race? In that respect, I'm worried. And I'm also worried of the chilling effect on us, the media. Will we be on guard? Will we be asking all the tough questions? I think, Yonit, that eventually, at the end of the day, if there's something that I still believe in, is the DNA of the Israeli citizen. There's still a democratic gene there. And I think that most Israelis have too much to lose and won't let government take democracy away from them. I hope so. When I'm thinking about our reality and the life that we're living in this terrible disaster area of ours, there's one text that is with me ever since the summer of 2006. It's the eulogy that David Grossman wrote to his son Uri. And it's amazing. I was there at the funeral. I come back to this text every once in a while. And yesterday night, I came back to it and I figured that almost 20 years after it was written, it is more chilling than ever. And I think it answers most of your questions in the course of our conversation. I'll read you just two paragraphs, the ending paragraphs of this eulogy. Said David, I will say nothing on the war which you were killed, Uri. We, our family, already lost this war. The state of Israel will have to reckon with it while we stay with our pain and with so many good friends and even people we never met who wrap us with endless love, and I thank them. I wish we will find ways to shower each other with love and solidarity in different times as well. That's perhaps our most unique national resource. That's our biggest natural treasure, a human treasure. I wish we rescue ourselves out of this horrific violence which has taken over so much of our lives. I wish we get back to our senses and save ourselves now at the very last moment, because hard times are still ahead. Uri was a very Israeli boy, even his name was. He was the essence of Israeliness as I would want to see it. And he was a person of values. This almost forgotten word. In our crazy, cruel world, it's not cool to be a person of values or a humanist or simply to be sensitive to the hardship of the other, even if the other is your enemy in the battlefield. But from Uri, I learned that you can be both, that we have to stand up for ourselves, לעמוד על נפשנו, but we have to do both, to defend our lives and defend our souls, to insist to save our soul from the force of simplistic thinking, from the corruption of cynicism, from the pollution of the heart and the disrespect of the person, which are the biggest curse truly menacing anybody who lives in a disaster area like ours. That was written for Uri, David Grossman's son, who was killed in the Second Lebanon War 19 years ago this month.
Still echoes today, and I think love and solidarity is what we can stay with or leave with this conversation. Ilana, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you, Yonit and Jonathan. Thank you very much.
Always so great to have Ilana on the podcast. She manages to, phrase things in a way that few people have that talent like she does. We need to distribute our awards as always, but we should say that according to Jewish tradition, right, we are in the Ben HaMetzarim week, so that is the time when we need to reflect on the destruction of the temples because of baseless hate. So we're being very gentle with our chutzpah words, but they're not about hate. They're just about, pointing out things that are chutzpah, right? We're okay here in the days leading into Tisha B'Av. Are we okay?
Yes, these
to
are
do the
gentle,
chutzpah words, the rabbi of the
loving.
podcast, Jonathan Friedland. Yes, we're doing the gentle loving.
I'll deliver my ruling. I think these are gentle, loving, chiding rather than excoriation or baseless hatred. That would be the defense I'd make. Although once people hear them, they may think that gentle chiding is not nearly good enough. I'm going to grab the Mensch Award to be distributed, but you kick us off with the Chutzpah Awards.
So first of all, I have two options, if I may. One of them is Deborah Turnus, the CEO of BBC News. She formerly worked at NBC Universal, by the way, explaining on a staff meeting about the BBC documentary, which was pulled because of the fact that it broke impartiality rules. She says, and she tries to explain, there's a difference between the armed wing and the political wing of Hamas. This is what she says in a staff meeting in front of 500 people. We should note that both the political wing and the armed wing, if you really want to make that distinction, both of them are deemed terrorist organizations. In the UK, and one of the, I think, Middle East specialist, Adam Fox on Twitter, posted this, and then he wrote, Hitler was a member of the political wing of the Nazi Party and not an active member of the SS. So you can take that comparison, if you will. The other nominee, if I may, a new entry in our Chutzpah Awards, U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee, who showed up at the trial of Benjamin Netanyahu. We should mention this is after Donald Trump wrote that this is a witch hunt. He wanted to see for himself what it looked like. He sat in the courtroom only for a few minutes because the trial itself then was derailed that day because of the tensions on the Syrian border. But that was enough for him to say that this is, the president was right, calling this a witch hunt. I don't think it's at all amusing, by the way, because if you recall last week, Trump threatened Brazil with 50% tariffs if they don't cancel the charges against former President Bolsonaro. So this can go into serious territory. But this is, of course, one country, as friendly as it may be, interfering in the court procedures of another country. That is something that, I think we should point out.
Very much so. And I do think, by the way, this is quite deliberate by Trump in the Brazil case, in the Israel case. I think he wants to break down the global norm that says democratically elected leaders are subject to the law. And I think he wants there to be a new norm that leaders are not subject to the law, they're above the law. And that's why he's quite deliberately going for this Brazil and Israel case. No, I think the chutzpah is certainly in that, but also in the idea that Mike Huckabee, who is not a Hebrew speaker, sitting in a trial for 5 minutes, and he sees enough to decide that this is a miscarriage of justice and it's completely wrong. I would love to say to him, well, what exactly did you hear in the legal proceedings that brought you to this view, specifically during the 5 minutes you were there, Ambassador Huckabee? Obviously, it was all a show and all a sham, and just, pretty disgraceful, I think. So the Mensch Award, which it is my privilege to present, I don't think we talk about Billy Joel enough. We began with Fiddler on the Roof, but we love Billy Joel as well. He is the subject of a new 2-part documentary by HBO called And So It Goes. He addressed there a question which a few people had wondered about, which is he did a show at Madison Square Garden now 8 years ago, August 2017, in which he appeared with a yellow star, sort of 1940s era Nazi style yellow star sewn on to his jacket. And people had wondered about this. I have to say that's a gesture I really dislike. I think it really debases the significance and meaning of that when other people do it as a gimmick. Remember, we saw it during COVID. People wore it to suggest they were there, being asked to have a vaccine is equivalent to being persecuted as a Jew, etc. In this documentary, Billy Joel explains why he was doing it. And it was related to the fact that the Charlottesville episode had just happened, in which you'll remember far-right and white supremacists, neo-Nazis marched chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Donald Trump afterwards said there were very fine people on both sides. That was the prompt. Billy Joel tells this documentary, I was angry. He thought, we fought a war to defeat these people. And he said that the president should have come out and said, those are bad people. There's no qualifying it. The Nazis are not good people, period. And he said he wore a star to say, and at this moment he put a hand on his heart and said, no matter what, I will always be a Jew. So that was the background and context. I don't think everyone had fully understood that about what Billy Joel was doing. So I think for that and for speaking, he speaks then as well about his family has a very traumatic history involving the Holocaust. He talks about all of that. And so I think a Mensch Award for the Piano Man, partly I think just because it's an excuse to talk about Billy Joel, or writer of many bangers. I will forgive him Uptown Girl, an appalling song, but some of the others.
We're
just
completely aligned on that. It's
I'm so glad. Terrible.
I look, we can give the Mensch Award to Billy Joel every week, to be honest. But I think you found a good excuse to do it this week. Favorite Billy Joel song, by the way? We agreed on our, the least favorite, but what is our favorite?
That's a really great question. What's the one Piano Man is itself fantastic. It is a rousing sort of banger that you do have to shout at the top of your voice. No, there will be others.
I'm very jealous if you saw him in concert, because it started with me being jealous of your recent interview. You haven't?
No,
okay.
I didn't.
Okay.
No.
We know who our musical guest in the next Unholy Live is going to be. That's okay. It's done.
That would be good, wouldn't it? That would be good. No, look, there are a few cheesy ones in there, but I think there is some really lasting songs. I quite like that We Didn't Start the Fire. I like the kind of current affairs as lyric. I think that's quite good.
I think that the fact that we're living in a world in which We Didn't Start the Fire, every verse was a decade. Now it's like a week. I think that is where we live now. Okay, very worthy Mensch Award, sir. I applaud your choice. And we are winding up our conversation. We will remind our listeners to please subscribe on YouTube. And also, we go pretty granular on our political conversations. So also, we'd like to hear from you either on our Instagram or Spotify or, YouTube. Just comment if you like it or not. Should we go even more granular on Israeli politics is a question I would like to ask our listeners. And we will say our thank yous to Michal Porat, and you and I will meet next week.
We will. I'll look forward to it. See you then.